Yeah.
and go back, or you do arrow.
Oh yeah, I'll do the little holdy thing.
Well, here's the holdy thingy.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So the policy is, it's just pretty open into it. Well, we're going to go through this tonight. So. Read into the bullet point. Correct. Okay.
Wait,
So that would be a special meeting.
okay. Maybe I just looked at her bucket. Like, I have questions. Yeah.
You guys are all like color coordinated.
How did that happen?
I don't know.
Oh, yeah, kind
Cool
of.
when that happens. Karen, you got the memo too?
I know. We just changed it.
It is. I know. I'm like, wait, this is too many.
Too many things to think about it.
How
How are you? Melissa. You want me to move your stuff?
I am. She's gonna be upset with me, but there's a reason why I want to be closer to the board because we're gonna use the paper and notes and things. I'm like,
You just move her beside you.
oh wait.
Some of your things done. Oh, not really.
Well, pens you got.
I didn't know who had one and who might need one, so I just brought a few in here because we're doing note activity. Yeah, so that's why I was like, I wasn't sure, so I brought all kinds of resources. So,
But I do like sticky. I like all
so I brought all kinds of like.
I share that love. Have you seen the really big stickies or like the big?
Okay, it's 5:30 on the dot, and we're calling this special meeting to order, special work session meeting to order. Apparently, I have more to learn, but Director Daniels is excused due to a previous commitment, and I would like to start off right off the bat with just a couple of comments that it would be good if we're going to go over a lot of budget things tonight. If we kind of just glance, not tonight, but when you get a chance, over policy 6001 and 6002, kind of read over that in your homework. We might want to pull those policies maybe up with 1000 series to start working on pretty soon. And now I'm going to call on Dr. Watts to begin the work session.
Thank you, President Hamada, members of the board, staff, community, and friends. I would first like to remind us that this is budget season, and as we continue to provide information, share, and teach, not just tell, about the process of how our school district budget works. One comparison that we found to be fitting is to compare our budgeting process to a home budget, and that's the theme that will be overarching for tonight's presentation. I would like to call upon Dr. Harmon to introduce our presenter this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, board. This is great. So this will be the first of what technically is it's the beginning of our budget season conversations. But ironically, tonight we will not do a whole lot of talking about FY21. So because before we get into the meat and potatoes and deep decision making of FY21, we've got to have a foundation of what happens with budgets and kind of where decision points are and what our flexibilities are with some of that and what the timeline is for the full process. And so we're going to go over that tonight, create lots of space for questions and discussion and all of that, so that as we move forward throughout this process over the course of several months and we finally get to August and adopt a budget, there'll be lots of time for all of that weigh-in and understanding, and lots of opportunities so that no board member gets lost in the decision-making or the process. So that's our goal. Ben is going to start us off with more of the finance and accounting true detail, and I'm going to pass it over to you, Ben, and then we'll shift back.
Is it okay if I stand as I do this, because I may want to do something? Okay. All right, good evening. It's good to see you all again. So in preparing this presentation, I was reflecting on the fact that I think in the 22 years that I've been working in one form or another in public school finance, I think I've given probably 100 presentations or close to it on budgeting or finance, be it micro level or macro level. And one of the comments that I always get is, it's so complicated. You know, like, I think to most people who are not part of this world, their first reaction to it is it just seems so, the complexity is like exploding. And so, in fact, in 2008, I actually gave a presentation in the legislature on the topic of why is education budget so complicated. That was actually a presentation that I did. And so, you know, when we think about the budget process and when we think about some board members that have been with us and others of whom will be this first process, we've kind of changed things up a little bit. So this is a very different presentation than the first presentation that you might have seen in other years. And so a couple things you'll notice about this presentation. First, there's not a lot of data in this presentation, and that's on purpose, okay? The first thought is to kind of give you a basic conceptual introduction to why we do what we do and how we do it. And I think as Dr. Watts mentioned, using the lens of personal finance to explain the simple concept. So the one thing I don't want you to misinterpret is, I really am going to try to make this extremely relatable. And if you want to add more complexity on that, certainly ask all the questions you want, right? I'm not trying to imply that you don't know more than what's here. You know a lot more. But starting at the very foundational step, I think a lot of people found it very helpful because they might have known 9 other things, but they didn't know the 10th thing. And that 10th thing, they're glad that somebody took the time to just do a very pedestrian walkthrough of that. So this has a very non-data rich, basic walkthrough feel of it. Your questions are helpful, and you can go ahead and interrupt me at any time, and we can harvest those and use those and maybe answer them in the moment, or kind of put them on the billboard and come back to them at the end. And then I'm going to be handing it off to Dr. Herman, who's going to try to use this as a springboard for talking about our values. So, without further ado, I've had a lot of opportunities to try to explain school finance to different audiences, and I think we may see members of the Fiscal Recovery Task Force trickle in at one point. We've had this actual exact conversation, and I have always found it helpful that when people see complexity in school district budgeting, to explain it through the lens of personal finance, because we all have personal finances, and whether we realize it or not, a lot of the operations and things that happen in a school district setting are very relatable. So for most of us, we operate different accounts in our lives, right? We have a checking account, we have a savings account. Some of us have a 401k. In my case, I have what's called a 529. I got kiddos I'm trying to get through college, right? And in many same ways, that does parallel what the district has. The district has different funds. Now, that's not a complete, can't extend that metaphor too far, but the basic idea is in the same way that I can't just transfer money in and out of my 401k into my general fund whenever I want, and that each account has its own rules and set of principles and why it exists. The same is true for school districts that operate 5 funds. So you can think of them kind of as bank accounts. That's a little oversimplified, but bank accounts with specific purposes, specific rules. Some you can transfer in and out of, and others you can't. Okay? So I'm going to walk through conceptually what each of these 5 funds do and their purpose, okay? And the easiest one to explain, I think, is the general fund. So to me, it's helpful to think of the general fund as like my basic household operating budget, right? My regular expenses that I incur on a monthly basis. When it comes to the general fund of the school district, you know, the revenue for your general fund at home is probably the income you bring in your job. For us, we have two major sources of revenue as a school district, to just oversimplify it for the general fund. One is state apportionment, which is supported not entirely, but primarily by state property tax. You pay a property tax on any property you owe, and a preponderance of that goes to support public schools at the state level. And local school levies, which is certainly apropos to phone calls I made last night to registered voters. Okay. What's noteworthy about the revenue we take in the general fund is it's, yeah, not entirely, some of these are oversimplifications, but just generally, it's pretty much predicated on how many students we get. There's some minor exceptions to that, but more or less, if we get more students, we get more money. If we lose students, we get less money, right? And then, as somebody, let's say you're good with your home finances and you really like to stay on top of your home finances, you have certain reports or documents that you rely on, right? Probably your pay stub. You know, you print your pay stub out every month just to see, like, why is a certain thing being deducted, or how much am I bringing in each month, or what am I paying in taxes for, right? And it gives you kind of a detailed reconciliation of the revenue you're taking in. And you also want your bank statement, right? To see, like, what's coming through your account. Does anything go through there that shouldn't have been, et cetera. So the school district's not that different. Our apportionment report, which, by the way, if you click on this, it'll take you to our apportionment report. Really, I think it's helpful to think of it as a pay stub. It's like a 6-page report. Actually, if you print the whole thing, it can be up to 30 pages, but it just goes line by line. It tells us how we're getting paid, you know, what types of apportionment we're getting, based on what assumptions, in what categories, under what limits, et cetera. Okay? So it's helpful that people think of apportionment as some big giant technical report that is just so complex you never want to see it. It's your pay stub. It's the pay stub for the school district. What did we bring in this month and why? And then, for the most part, our bank is the county. So we get reports from the county. Just like you get, you know, your little email from Wells Fargo or Bank of America saying, here's your statement for this month. We get them from the county, same deal. So we mentioned how student enrollment is like a big deal in what drives our revenue. And one of the things, there's not a lot of data in this presentation, but there are two data slides that just say, you know, we've had an interesting history in the district about what we've projected for our enrollment. But in terms of the actual enrollment that we've had, just look back to 2011, 25,400-ish FTE students. Today, we're within 100. We're pretty much where we were. And one of the things that's a historical marker for Canada is remarkably stable enrollment. You know, we've had some peaks and valleys, but we're more or less where we were 10 years ago in terms of our total K-12 enrollment. What is interesting, though, is we're not where we were 10 years ago. I think we included this slide because I think Director Vigadaslam asked for it specifically. Look at that light blue line. So as our total population has remained almost exactly stable, the students availing themselves of the Running Start opportunity is growing geometrically. It has all sorts of implications, financial, programmatic, and otherwise, in the public schools. Okay? So we went over bank account number 1, right? General fund. Bank account number 2. I'm using that phrase colloquially here. It's not really a bank account, it's a fund, right? Capital projects fund. What is it for? Again, slight oversimplification, but more or less for building and renovating school buildings. Okay? There's a couple other things. But building and renovating school buildings. Okay? Major sources of revenue. Local property tax. Now, the real source of revenue is when we sell bonds, but we pay the bonds off with proceeds from the local property tax. Okay? We also in this district have a capital and tech levy. Some districts have them, some districts don't. Some districts go out for a bond and they rely on the proceeds of the bond for this fund. Other districts have a bond and go to the voters for a technology levy or a capital technology levy. We are such a district. So the first 2 bullets apply to us. And then the third, there are certain expenses that the state matches when we go and we build a new Covington Elementary in so there are proceeds associated with that, some impact fees, some smaller items. Okay? Here, the revenue that we get isn't necessarily as linked directly to the number of students we get, like our pay stub, if you will. It's related, but it's not specifically driven by it. So as we get like 100 more kids, it's not like our capital project proceeds went up, right? Capital project proceeds are based on that bond that we sold, right? And we went out and sold individual issues. That's how we get our money, okay? Capital projects fund has its own, remember our first slide? You know, each of our accounts have different rules, you know? I can't just take money out of my 401k anytime I want, transfer it over to my, right? Capital fund has its own set of detailed rules. Certain things you can spend proceeds from the capital fund on, as particularly true for bond proceeds. Bonds are regulated by the Internal Revenue Service because we sell them to people out in the world, people who are buying our bonds, you know, so we're making assurances about how it's being used. Okay. So that's two funds. Let's add a third fund, the ASB fund. So the way I explain the ASB fund through the lens of personal finance is, you know, the ASB budgets are done by the students and they're for the students. But you're ultimately responsible. So it's kind of like when you have a kid and you co-sign for something, you know? Like first time I got an apartment, I get my dad to co-sign so I can move off campus. Dad, I want me and my 3 kids. And Dad's like, great, you pick the apartment, fine. But if there's a problem with the security deposit, right, it comes back to my dad because he co-signed it, right? ASB budget, there's kind of this tension where it's like, yep, these are budgets that students do, they're approved by students, working with the ASB advisors, fundraising that the students do. But the district is responsible for how that money is spent and that it conforms to the laws and guidance and district policy regarding use of public money. So there is sometimes some tension there. A good way of summarizing, it's a good little, I forget what they call these, acronym. A good way to remember what ASB is for is the acronym CARS. Okay? This is how I learned it. Cultural, athletic, recreational, or social. So, and I think the phrasing comes straight out of the manual. So, students can raise money and ASB money, and those monies can be used for activities that are either cultural, athletic, recreational, or social. CARS. It's a helpful little thing to have in the back of your mind. So ASB fund also has its, and these links are active. So if if you really were interested, you could go and bore into like chapter 7, whichever chapter it is, of the allowable uses of ASB fund. Okay? Okay, now we're in the 4th fund. Transportation Vehicle Fund. One of the more self-explanatory funds. What is it for? Well, by gosh, it's for vehicles, transportation. We acquire school buses using the Transportation Vehicle Fund, be they new or used, be they gas or electric. The way that we get revenue into this fund, is the state kind of makes an assumption on how long they think our buses should last. They have a schedule, and they pay us based on an assumption that we're going to replace our buses on a certain. They assume most of them are going to last 13 years. There's a certain class of bus they assume are going to last 8 years. There's complicated schedules, but you get the idea that, so somebody's going to say, well, I think your Dodge Camry is going to last 7 years, so I'm going to give you a little bit each month so that if you save it, you'd be able to replace, you'd be on a cycle of replacing your Camry every 6 months. It's the same idea with a bus. We think your bus is going to last 13 years. So we're going to figure out how much we're going to give you each year so that you're on a cycle being able to, in theory, stay with, safe and reliable schools. Big deal. You have a
question.
Yeah.
Is their budget for the 13 years, is that adequate? I mean,
Yeah, I think most districts would say no. I think that one of the things that's, I guess, interesting about the transportation vehicle fund is that you may, not really sure if we're seeing that on February 11th, but some districts actually go out for a transportation vehicle levy. So they they levy amounts for buses. And you see kind of a smattering across the state of districts that do or don't do that. And it just depends on, your community needs. And I know one of the things we've done at Kent, and I don't supervise transportation, so I don't want to over-represent. I'm just kind of reporting that we've been pretty savvy about buying relatively new to us buses, like buses that are used but still in their early cycle. We bought 4 or 5 from Issaquah last year that were, still in great shape, get a great deal. Our transportation director is really savvy that way. But communities have their own way of kind of meeting that need. But I think that the schedule has been under fire for being maybe not the greatest, not as robust.
Do you have any idea of a history, how much over the years that has been inadequate?
I know a lot about it, actually. I used to be the person in the legislature who would argue with people about, yeah, so it's been one of the areas that's been least scrutinized at the state level. There's been so much attention to class size, compensation, even capital has received a fair amount of scrutiny. The mechanism by which the state funds school buses, I think, has flown under the radar a little bit. And I think it just comes down to, as more and more districts go out locally for levies, it becomes less maybe of a pressure point. But it's a whole study unto itself in terms of why it hasn't been a huge issue. But it has been a huge issue for certain communities. But like state legislation, proposals to redo the formula, just hasn't really been a major focus these last 10 years of McCleary.
But would you say in Kent that's been a major issue at all in the budget?
No, like I said, I don't supervise capital or transportation. I'd be interested in Justin's thought about that.
I'm just curious.
Like I said, Israel's most recent move was to buy a series of good, solid, used buses, and to try, I think, earlier this year, I think there was a robust conversation about taking advantage of some grant money to get into some electric buses, right? So they're actually willing to pay us to, like overcome that barrier to get it, So I will say that 2 years ago, with the general fund underwater by close to $7 million, transportation vehicle fund was perhaps not a
That's what I'm just trying to get at.
headliner issue to
Okay.
begin with. Not to say it doesn't require scrutiny and ongoing meetings. Okay, so that's 4 funds. Do the last fund. Debt service fund. Okay, this is the one where people go. From a personal finance standpoint, and again, all of these are oversimplification. I see Ken over there getting uncomfortable with stuff. Like, these are just basic, right? The basic idea is you're paying your mortgage. Like in a family situation, you have a mortgage, you make payments on the mortgage, you're paying off something you built over a long, you might have a 30-year note, right? And I got payments of $1,500 a month, and I'm paying off over a long period of time an initial investment, right? Well, it's not that dissimilar from bonds in schools, right? So we go out, we sell bonds. We just sold some bonds earlier this year. Did real great with our interest rate. Well, where'd those proceeds come from? Right? People bought our bonds, right? Why are they buying our bonds? Well, they're buying their bonds because they're going to make money as we repay those bonds, right? How do those bonds get repaid? We collect from the taxpayers, right? So it's not all that dissimilar from a mortgage. You go out and build a house, let's say. You take out a loan, or you get your loan, you go to the bank. Why is the bank giving you a loan? Well, they think they're going to make money. How are they going to make money? Because you're going to pay them back over 30 years, right? So, I don't know, not to make assumptions about, but if you do happen to own a home or any property, you see that big amortization schedule, it goes like 30 years out, you can see how much you're supposed to pay in principal and interest for the remaining, and you think, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm paying all this interest.
Yeah.
Well, school districts, we have those schedules, we have those debt schedules. We have a lot of them for every single series that we've gone out and sold, that we have a schedule of repayment, right? So a homeowner has one, we have 10, or wherever it may be. Okay.
This may be an oversimplification, but if I wanted to pay down my mortgage faster, I can make an additional interest payment. Can you do that on these two?
In some cases. In some cases, we'd be diving into a little complexity there, but I think the terms that are what you sell the bonds to bondholders, some of them want guarantees of making a certain amount, right? And that's premised on paying over a certain period. But you can refinance, school districts have done that. Our interest rate is so great, right, that
You wouldn't want to, yeah.
okay. So, does that make sense? I mean, if you understand the concept of a family going out and getting a loan and paying it out over 30 years, then you understand what the debt service fund is. We're just collecting taxes to pay off our mortgages. Okay? And then the other basic elemental thing that I think is helpful is people tend to conflate bonds and levies. You ever heard that? I thought we just went out for a bond, right? And so somebody taught me kind of like the cars thing in ASB, where it's a good little helpful. So a good little helpful thing for bonds versus levies is bonds are for buildings, levies are for learning, right? Bonds build school buildings and other capital expenditures. And levies support, you know, that general fund, that notion or basic budget of, you know, pay for housing, transportation, food, right? And so they are discrete in their purposes and separate. So I remember seeing a news article, like I'd been here like a month, and one of the news articles I said, one of the citizens was like incredulous that the district was in a financial situation because they just passed a bond, right? And so it takes some explaining to say, well, that's the general fund, right? And the general fund's at a certain state, and this is capital.
Every district hold debt like this, like the mortgage, like if you're comparing this to like a household
Yeah.
mortgage, but some people.
It is an oversimplification.
Yeah,
right?
but some people have, pay off their mortgage
Yeah.
early
Yes.
and they don't carry any debt.
Yeah.
So do some districts in the state not carry debt?
I couldn't rattle them off the top of my head, but definitely districts have different degrees of how much they are leveraged in debt.
Okay.
And there's a cap, so there's a calculation in terms of, as a municipal entity, you can't exceed a certain amount. We are way, way, way below our cap. Well, I see, I think on February 11th, is it Lake Washington? Somebody's going out with a huge bond, and so it's definitely, there's definitely differences across districts in terms of the size of bonds the districts go out. And remember, size, you gotta be able to repay those bonds. How are you paying those bonds? By the taxes you're collecting. So eventually, you gotta fit it into your tax rate, right? So districts that are going out for really large bonds, they gotta figure out how to fit the mortgage payment into their annual tax rate. Not to get too complicated. Remember that graph with our tax rate, the 3 different chunks of it? One of those chunks is this. How much are we gonna be paying for our mortgage this year? It changes each year because it's not just one mortgage, we've got multiple mortgages. Okay, is that hitting the spot? Okay. So we made it through the 5 funds. So just like a school district have 5 funds, and maybe you have 3 bank accounts, it's the same general principle, different rules. Can't just switch money back and forth. Sometimes you can switch money back and forth under very specific purposes, right? But they're separate for a reason. Okay, so we just spent some time talking about funds like ASB and transportation vehicle, but this is just to give you a flavor for the fact that, so if we're a $600 million enterprise in total, and $420 million of that is the general fund, you can imagine that from a policy standpoint, just generally for all school districts, but specifically for Kent, given our history in the general fund. General fund is kind of the focus of the policy conversation. Most, not all, but a lot of your values, a lot of the concerns of stakeholders, I would say the majority of those manifest in the general fund. Issues come up in other funds for sure, but you can see it's certainly lopsided as a dollar number, and it tends to be lopsided as a discussion. How many times have you had a board meeting, have people come and talk about the transportation vehicle fund, right? Okay, so now I'm gonna, for that reason, let's kind of go one depth deeper into that first fund, the general fund, and stick with this line of, personal finance. First thing is, well, how do we get our money? Okay, what's our income? So, I think you can say safely for the first time ever, we now eclipse 80% in terms of the amount of revenue that comes from the state in the general fund. And that's a significant thing. And so, in my career in Washington, I've watched that number steadily grow as the McCleary lawsuit has come to fruition, as there's been a policy push to limit the inequities that exist across local levies. And so these lines have been going like this, I used to produce graphs 10 years ago that, would show high 60s, So it really has been a very significant shift in the state, not just in Kent. And so local sources now, which people used to have the general rule of thumb, well, it's about 1/5, about 20%. It's not anymore. We've got a couple of different local sources, but you see the local tax, the levy is about 11%. Then we have kind of a sundry list of other, what we consider local revenue sources, which might be fines and fees, and different revenue sources of that kind that tend to be, non-material from looking at the general fund as a whole. But state contribution is at the highest it's ever been, local contribution at the lowest it's ever been from a percentage standpoint, And so one thing I want to touch on here, we talked about the pay stub earlier and how your apportionment statement is kind of like your pay stub. And since 80% of our money comes from the state, it helps to understand a little bit of well, how do they decide? How do they decide how much Kent is going to get? Right? And so, again, going back to the notion of personal finance, sometimes when you're applying for a loan or you're filling out a survey, you sometimes hear the phrasing, the average family of 4 gets, or the average family of 4 needs, or kind of using the construct of an average American family as the mechanism for having discussion. Well, that's kind of what the state does now for how they allocate money to school districts through something called the prototypical school funding formula. Have you heard of the prototypical school funding formula? Okay. So, it seems very complicated, mysterious, but really all it is in the same way that you might think of an average family of 4, 4.2, or whatever the 2.4 children, or whatever that metric is. The state uses a funding formula that says the average elementary school needs this, and the state will fund that. The average middle school needs this, and the state will fund that. The average high school. So they use prototypes of school level to think about the staffing composition of that school. And it was at the heart of the McCleary decision and at the heart of many of the funding decisions that the state has subsequently made. So what we used to see before the prototypical school model was that we would just kind of get big lumps of funding that you couldn't really figure out what was what. So they'd say, here's all your money for staffing. They wouldn't say, here's how much we're assuming for teachers, here's how much we're assuming for guidance counselor, here's how much we're assuming. They would just give you a lump and say, you do how which you will. And so the prototypical school model has kind of brought forth those specific assumptions about staffing. Here's the class size that the state assumes it's funding. Here are the number of nurses that the state assumes it's funding. Here are the number of guidance. So when you see our levy materials, you see statements about the state only funds this many nurses. And we wouldn't even have been able to produce that 10 years ago because the state was never explicit about what things need. And so that's where most of the funding comes from. And so I think it's important to understand that in a household budget, you know, after you get done figuring out how you're going to pay for your housing and your transportation and maybe your nourishment, you've pretty much figured out what the cost structure is for your household budget. It's the same for school district. There's a few decisions that drive a vast majority of the costs. So once you've made decisions about your staffing levels, and once you've made bargaining decisions and compensation decisions about how you're going to pay those staff, those two decisions are by far and away, just statistically, the most significant in terms of driving the expenditure side equation. And for a household budget, is how big of a house am I going to live in? Right? I mean, that would drive a huge amount. Now, what kind of car am I going to drive? And I can choose economy models. I can, right? Okay. And so you see that reflected on the expenditure side of the equation, where we're at 81% of our budget. That is driven by essentially three things. How many staff, by that I mean what class size assumptions, in terms of teachers, what are those staff paid, and what benefits are offered those employees. Once you've made those three decisions, which I realize of course there's detailed decisions underlying those, but those three buckets more or less dictate the cost structure of the budget. Now this slide is not really, I have to admit, not terribly in keeping with this sort of conceptual, but there was a specific request to put this slide in here. So this seems very detailed and technical, but I didn't want to ignore the request.
It will serve you well later,
Okay.
trust me.
Right? So we're like going from the nice storytelling to wham, technical, but just for a moment, one of the things that you'll see as you go through the process is like the budget book, which is like, 150-page document with all the budgeting schedules. And we make some assumptions about people knowing what the account code structure is, right? So when we say, here's the level of budget by program, or here's the level of budget by activity, or here's the level of program or budget by object. Sometimes we make the assumption that that's a shared knowledge, and it may not be. And so the account code string is rather complicated, and I only include it because you asked me to, but here's a basic concept to latch onto. Look at the phrase PAO, P-A-O, okay? I always remember PAO. Program, activity, object. You probably don't need to understand every individual component of the account code sequence to operate as an effective board member, but to know that we code expenses and we budget for programs, activities, and objects is helpful. So when we talk about objects, we talk about, I can show you for the budget how much of the budget is salary, how much of the budget is benefit related, how much of the budget is associated with supplies and materials. These are object level, right? If I were going to show you a program, I would say, here's how much of the budget is associated with the LAP program. Here's how much budget is associated with the inclusive education program. And you'll see the special education term pop up a lot because in the state budgeting materials, that's the term they use. We use inclusive education. And so how? Program activity object offers 3 different slices of essentially the same information. I could show you the budget sorted by program, and if in fact have done this, the budget status updates do this for you. I can show it to you by activity, and I can show it to you by object. Okay? Okay. So, you know, budgeting can be complicated, despite my efforts to simplify it today. And I think one of the key principles in budget decision making is usually there's a dividing point between a technical budget execution issue and a policy issue, right? And that's a tough thing for board members to wrestle with, I would imagine, right? And so part of what I think what Dr. Herman's been talking about is the idea of having values and priorities in the budget, right? And sometimes that can be conflated with the execution of the budget, right? And the technical undertaking of compiling and executing the budget. And in my experience, the best, I've worked for elected officials my entire life in one form or another. And the most robust examples of budget making are when the elected official is kind of explaining, here are my values and my priorities, and they allow the technicians to represent to them how those values may or may manifest in different options. Right? The ones that haven't been robust is when the technical and the policy are indistinguishable, and they spend as much time talking about the technical execution of the budget as much as what story does the budget tell. And so I would like to kind of, one of the thoughts I want to leave you with is this notion that budgets tell a story about priorities and values. And you may not know what that story is, but it still tells a story. And part of good budget making is to be like conscious of what story you're trying to tell with your budget, because it is an expression of the values of the organization. Okay? So I think everybody on the board, with the exception of Director Nicolasa, I think, may not have ever heard these, but a couple months after coming to the district, we established 5 big audacious goals for the Kent School District budget. They're represented here. These were written 2 years ago, so it's fun to look at them now and see where we're at relative to those. The first one was we're really making an intentional effort to connect the budget to the blueprint and to understand what role we have, either direct or indirect, in supporting the priorities expressed in the blueprint. The second was to come into compliance with our own policy that said we had this aspiration to have a 5% unassigned fund balance and hadn't complied with it since 2014. So it's been at that point, what, 4 years. And a celebration is that we closed here, the first year where we in fact are compliant with that policy. Keep a revenue and expense ratio positive. That's seems like a really technical jargoning term, but in the parlance of personal finance, it's just, we should be taking in more than we're spending. Right? We do that, it's credit cards will catch up on you. If you rely on the credit card, that ain't going anywhere good, right? And that's a good metaphor for any system that spends more than it brings in consecutive years, regardless of whether you have a fund balance or not. Okay. The fourth was eliminate the interfund loan. At that time, the district relied on the interfund loan to stay cash positive in the general fund, particularly in the months prior to levy collections. So we have eliminated that interfund loan. That's another celebration. We eliminated it mid last year. And then finally, at least in one case, our bond rating with, I think it was Standard & Poor's, was down to BBB+, which is just unacceptable for a municipal entity. And so, you know, bond ratings matter because they're like your personal credit score. And if you have a good credit score, you get a lower interest rate, right? And so it matters. And when we sold a bond, just prior to my coming on, we sold a bond, we did see the effects of like, oh, okay, yeah, there's a difference. You don't have a good credit score, you pay a little more, right? But just this last year, we had 2 ratings agencies that improved or upgraded our bond rating outlook. So the bond rating and the bond rating outlook are 2 different things. What you can think of the bond rating outlook is, are we headed, is there a green arrow up or is there a red arrow down in terms of like where things are headed? And so you'll see here that, you know, they offered, in the case of Standard & Poor's, they improved it to a positive outlook, and in the case of Moody's, they said, we're going to improve it to steady until we see your audited financials for fiscal year 19, which they will have not seen yet. But the reason this is meaningful is that it's really the first objective representation from an outside entity that, yeah, like there's clear, compelling evidence that the financial health and stability of the district and the general fund is improved. And so, and you see a lot of same language across the 2 write-ups in terms of, you know, the data isn't the data, you know, your financial statement is, they're looking at the same document, So prior to turning it over to Dr. Harmon, I think one of the things, in addition to kind of doing an extremely high-level conceptual review tonight that we haven't done in prior years, the other change is to just move this way up. So typically what has happened in prior years, in this sense, I kind of just inherited a schedule, is we never really got into the budget process until there was something to tell you, right? So in the prior years, you know, be waiting for the legislature to finish because they're going to tell us, like, they're going to give us the pay stub. Well, we don't have the pay stub yet, right? So we're going to meet, but we're going to speculate on. We don't have any. So typically the cycle has gone, legislature concludes, we get a better sense of our revenue outlook, then we move into staff, you know. But I think as you'll see, like the thought is there's conceptual values discussion to have at the very beginning, regardless of when the legislature finishes its business. And with that, I was going to turn it over to Dr. Harmon to do her part of it.
I have a quick question. Is all of the things that you presented, those are all good. Are they sustainable in the future? And it's probably come from, could you enlighten me how really that we achieved that? Was it to have our budget being met, and is that through staffing?
Which the financial improvements?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We want to do that? Okay. So, yeah, I've been asked this question a lot, and I've tried to answer it several times, and I guess I'm not hitting the spot. So the first thing I want to say is I'm trying to answer your question in good faith, and if I'm not answering it correctly, you can help me, like, give you the information that you want, okay? So my characterization would be there's, like, at least three things that were happening at the same time that helped contribute to the financial return, the recovery of the district, okay? And I'm not going to list these in a particular order, but without question, one of the factors was a significant increase in state funding, okay?
Right.
There's no disputing the fact
Right.
that had the legislature cut funding at the same time, we certainly would not have seen the same results, okay? So that needs to be said, and it's a truth, okay? The second thing is that, and this was happening both before and after I got here, and that each month I don't know, I try to cover all the information you get in those packets, but I'll take the moment to point out that you get a little PowerPoint in your packet that just shows the staffing levels year to year, okay? And it shows it month to month to month to month, so it goes back, it's an apples to apples in the sense that, so if we're looking at it in February of 2020, then you look at February of 19, February of 18, And so the year immediately following finishing negative general fund, I mean, the district made staffing cuts in 17-18. Those were actual cuts, and by cuts I mean, and I think we've had this conversation publicly a couple times, to me there's a difference between cuts, like literal cuts, versus not refilling vacancies, which is I think a fundamentally different budget exercise. But in 17-18, there were cuts. To the best of my recollection, they were not classroom cuts, they were central office cuts. And it happened in February, exactly 2 years ago. It was an extremely challenging time in our journey. I don't know if you have numbers off the top of your head, but you can, in terms of the number of people and all that, but you can see in those reports that you get, February 20, February 19, February 18, you can see the curve. And the 18 is the year that the staffing numbers drop, and those were primarily focused in the category we call classified staffing, which includes administrators. So a lot of administrators are classified staff. Very few, our principals are certified administrators, but almost all of our central office administrators are actually characterized and classified as classified staff. So staffing cuts, they happened. So funding improved, right? Staffing was reduced on some level, okay? There were cuts in 17-18, in 18-19, just checking myself in terms of, so the year that we completed last year, right? And again, at some point, I might need to, yeah.
Jump in whenever you.
I'll say something simple and then let
Okay.
you get it. So in 18-19, there were a number of positions that were not filled, which is different than what happened in 17-18, where individuals were, their position was eliminated. People left, there was actual, okay? So that's why I insist on making the distinction between cuts
I
and
understand.
vacancy, yeah. Because it is a huge difference in terms
It
of,
is.
yeah. And so, had those changes in staffing not occurred, and you look at that, you look at those bar graphs I'd give you, you could see that, staffing was on an upward trajectory, okay? So you got funding, you got staffing, okay? The third thing is that local levies. So we have been in a very volatile space with regards to our levy. So 2 years ago, when first month either of us were here, the legislature dealt us a setback to say no, we meant it.
Right,
You will
right.
not be raising more than $1.50 per thousand.
Yeah.
Which for the Kent School District was a significant loss of funding. So when you saw all those four-year outlooks, we're planning for a significant loss of all that local revenue, right? Because that was what the law said, right? Now, stay with me here, little complexity, but this is a key point. They said they were gonna drop it down to $1.50, but they were gonna do it halfway through the year. Because they do it on a calendar year, and we budget on a school year. So that first year, we kind of got a little bit of a benefit, and I talked to the board at one point about the notion of, you remember the triathlon story, and you had gone through the first hill and then you get a second hill. Well, we got a little bit of a valley there where we got to coast because they didn't take all of our local property taxes. They don't have them there, but we still got all the state funding. So there's this 1 year where we had this kind of one-time event to our benefit, not just Kent, but really any school district. And the situation was such that I thought the board and the executive cabinet was really very savvy at that time. Say, okay, we recognize that this is a one-time event. It's not, we can't rely on that forever. So we don't want to put the budget together to assume to spend every last bit of that dollar, because that's not sustainable, right? So that budget, if you go back and look at that budget budgeted for a fund balance of close to $20 million. It budgeted for a fund balance of close to $20 million. And the reason for that was understanding that, you know, and I'm trying to put it in the phrase of personal finance, but it would be like, you know, when you refinance your mortgage and they allow you to skip a payment, right? So if you went out and did your whole family budget over based on that 1 month, right? You're doomed. You're eventually going to pay your mortgage again. You did a little trick, right? Well, we got a little mortgage skip thing, essentially, right? And that benefited us. It benefited all school districts. It was smart. It was very smart. And it wasn't my decision. It was savvy on the part of the district leadership. So I think those three factors give you a pretty good overview of the fact that even though we settled a couple of large bargain contracts because we want to pay market rate and be good to our employees and all, even when those things happened as well, we managed to seize on that one-time event to our benefit, not do what some other districts do, which is to use the personal finance phrasing. When you skip that payment, build your budget on that and then realize that's very short term. What are we going to do next year, right? So, you know, I only say this just so you kind of know what's in my, I don't know if this helps, but I do sometimes have a hard time connecting about, I feel like those series of decisions were savvy on the part of the leadership. And sometimes they're portrayed as otherwise. And I have a hard time connecting to those simply because they seemed to me like methodical and strategic in light of where the district had been. And so I know you've experienced some frustration that I haven't explained, like I've tried a couple times and maybe it's been too much data, but that's kind of what happened. And so districts that didn't come out of that in the same way approached that 1 year a little differently, right? They approached that 1 year, again, to extend that metaphor, the mortgage skip, they spent through that mortgage skip. And so then the legislature reconvened again and said, oh, by the way, we're not going to limit you to $1.50. And it's like, okay, well, that's a little different, you know, that's a little different. We just spent a whole year fretting and being extremely conservative because you told us the law of the land would be X, and now it's not X, and now we look like we over budgeted. Well, people plan for the world that they've been given at the time that they're budgeting. And so
Ben, if I could add to that, on March 27th last year, we presented the staffing allocations based on that very fact of having a conservative, we did not want to spend what looked like an extra money, and so we budgeted. So if you're interested in seeing that presentation, it is online. It was March 27th, and we walked through the positions that we were not going to fill through attrition, and it was in light of the financial picture that Ben had shared. And so you're right, when the levy came, when the amount was changed, it did leave this piece where we've already staffed, and we've already gone through that process, and we made the decisions based on the financial picture we had at the time.
Also did the salary structure.
Yes, that was another piece I wanted to add. We absolutely, particularly at the central admin, looked at all of our salary compensations. We cut fringe benefits over 50%. So major changes in the compensation up here at the central admin to bring some additional cost savings to the budget.
So there's probably one very big thing that happened that doesn't necessarily show up on a ledger, and it's probably the most important to get to the heart of are the decisions that we made or will make sustainable. And it was about an intentional conversation and practice about changing behavior, of not spending more than we take in. We had intentional conversations reiterating that at leadership meetings, at all staffs, when we had opportunities with our public and all of that, but definitely with staffs in terms of living within our means. That became a commitment to you plan for what you intend to do within what limited budget we had, but then living within that. So opportunities to expand budget and all that work, I won't say contested, but considered and weighed against the value of that and the reasons why and all that. But living within our means became a focus, because that's probably a key behavioral shift for us that would determine practice moving forward, no matter what the amount of funding is coming from the state or from levy or any of other funding sources. If we can't live within our means, then that's going to be a problem in a longer strategy. And so that won't ever show up on a ledger, but that was actually something that became part of this. And that was part of that conversation about the big five. Like, there was a time when probably quite a few staff could talk about the 5 things that we were committed to and were trying to do and the reasons for that. But like, that's something that wouldn't ever show up on a ledger or something, but that became part of our discussion of living within and being intentional about our expenditures not exceeding our revenue.
When you know, we had 2 consecutive fiscal years where we finished negative, which is just like an unprecedented situation. And so when you're in that situation, it's really hard to argue for flexibility. You know what I mean? Like when you're on the razor's edge, everything errs on the side of restoring solvency, right? And so that's what the fund balance is that once you are kind of back into a normal mode financially as an organization, now you can say, okay, well, we can afford to make this decision, because if it flops over a little on the other side, well, we're solvent. So
Okay,
you can
that's
you can
very
purchase-
helpful, very
Oh, good.
helpful to me personally.
Oh, good,
Yeah.
good, yeah. So, I mean, I maybe we haven't mentioned that, but, you know, ending the year, fiscal year 18, negative close to $7 million, which means obviously there's no room for error. Ending the next year, we were positive by like $50,000 and then closed negative like 500, that's like 600,000, you know. So then that's all happening right in the middle of the budget cycle for the following year.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, what does a responsible municipal entity do in its budgeting cycle when it has no money, you know? And it has to make every decision on the conservative side, you know? And then get to a spot where you kind of normalize your decision making a little bit, because now if you have, you know, there's a confidence interval on every one of these decisions, and some of them can turn bad and some of them turn good. So if multiple turn bad for a year, well, we have a fund balance, so it's not the end of the world, right? And you can afford to take on a little more risk and a little more uncertainty, just like your personal finances.
So you're telling me it's sustainable, that's good.
Our current situation, it is sustainable if we sustain it.
Stays the course.
Well, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I
Our
hear you.
situation was sustainable in 2013, if we'd sustained it.
The 2018, 2019, where the positions were not filled, if you're going on the situation, the scenario you have now, when you're budgeting, could you possibly conservatively try to fill some of those positions?
Yeah, I don't make a lot of those decisions, but I'm happy to defer to.
So that is funny, because
That's exactly where
like,
we're
that's
going.
exactly the next activity.
Good
So like,
segue.
that is a perfect segue. But before we move into that, I want us to talk a little bit about this timeline calendar, because there's some flexibility there as a board, and I would like your input and feedback. So we can talk about the why it's designed the way they are, and then some of those dates are harder pressed than others because they exist under the law, and talk about those as well. And so obviously tonight we're here on February 5th, so that's not a proposed thing, that is a real date. The other real 2 dates that are absolutely hard pressed under the law is July 10th, which is called out, I'm sorry, we can include the RCW that is linked to that, but it's actually called out, the districts have to submit to their educational service district a plan for their next fiscal year budget and then a 4-year outlook, and that's statewide. And so although we will not have adopted a budget, we will still be in bargaining with some labor groups. We do have to submit under the law by July 10th that budget. So just know that we may not be finished. It's not a pressure to adopt or make a decision in a final way, but we will put something forth there. And it likely, at that point, probably will not look very, very different, because there's some other dates that we'll talk about in a second that set the course for what the larger portion of our budget looks like. And then there's the piece on August 26th, which is a Wednesday before school starts, because under the law as well, we cannot start a school year without an adopted budget by our board. So July 10th, August 26th, and then back in time leading up to that and what that looks like. And so I'll work forward, and then I'll let Mariah, we can tag team kind of the whys and some other things that happen behind these dates. So the next date that we'd like to consider is an early March date for a continuation of, I don't know if necessarily call it Budget 102 or 201, but it's this next conversation about other pieces of the budget at a greater level of detail, and then starting to cost out in broader senses some of the priorities and interests you all talk about tonight. Because we'll talk about our philosophies, and we'll talk about what we can do, and we can do lots of things, but we can't do everything. And so as we get to that, we have to start, as a board, you all need to hear what some of those ideas and what those commitments cost, so that you can help us decide the lever and to what extent. So not to make it too mathy, but we can't do 100% of everything. So do you want 10% of this thing and then focus 90% here, or what does that look like based on what some of those costs are? So we'll start to estimate some of those costs of the interest and priorities you all express. We'll talk a little bit more about the next level of detail. So based on some questions we hear tonight, some other things, we'll take some feedback and then design kind of what that next level of questioning and engagement looks like. But we're still not really talking about budget planning as of yet, because our intent as staff is to use these 2 sessions to hear from our board their interest, priorities, and values of our district, so we can start to plan. Because since 80% of our budget is people, and the cost associated with people, so benefits and salaries and things, there are some components of that for our different labor groups that start to take place that I'll let you speak to, that they need some help with.
So one of the pieces that we follow every year is our preliminary staffing allocation distribution timeline. And what that is a timeline of when allocations will go out to schools and central offices, to say for the upcoming year, the number of staff you'll have. We get that out at the end of March. This year will be March 30th. And the reason for that is because we need to compete for candidates. They're out there right now, particularly in K-12. Prime hiring season is April and May, sometimes even sooner in March. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the February 12th board meeting when we get into the recruitment plan. So the staffing allocation presentation to you on March 25th should reflect, this will be when we would share with you, we've heard your interest, we've heard we've had lots of conversation about where you'd like to see investments. And so we are presenting to you what we would like to present as our staffing allocations that reflect the interests of the board. So for instance, if you wanted to, for instance, place a huge emphasis or investment in social emotional learning, what might that look like in the final staffing allocations? So the purpose in us having these, as Jewel said, February 5th and the March 4th are very, very important for us as we think about how we're building staffing allocations moving forward. In addition, as Jewel mentioned, we are bargaining, right? So anything we are talking about can be impacted, not just compensation, also number of staff, because class size is a mandatory subject to bargaining as a working condition, and so it would be something that would be part of the bargaining. So that would, more than likely, bargaining ends on a full reopener in August. We work really diligently to try to get done sooner, and we would love to do that. We'll work with our labor partners to see if we can move things along just as quickly as possible, but to promise that it would be done by July 10th is probably not reasonable. So.
And it is not uncommon for districts to submit to the ESD and then adopt a budget that looks slightly different, because they have to then include the changes based on negotiated contracts that have happened in bargaining between July 10th and when the budget is adopted. It is also not uncommon, because the other law says that we have to adopt a budget before we start school, for a school district and school board to adopt a budget and then have to amend that budget to reflect changes that have happened in a bargain that has continued after school has started.
And that happened 2 years ago when we bargained the compensation increase.
So it's possible that the board would adopt a budget in August 26th, and that bargaining with labor groups would still be continued into September, and that we would have to bring back to the board an amended budget that reflects those changes in compensation, and the board have to re-adopt a budget. So just putting that out there, not saying that's not our goal, but that's a possibility. So I just wanted to recognize that. The other pieces of this then, so then the next dates are somewhat of a real date. So we would like to bring back to you at an official first budget work session. Exactly what Ben was talking about before when our traditional cycle starts. Legislative session has concluded. We now have a better sense of the revenues that we believe we'll bring in. And now we can combine what we believe to be real revenue information with the first tinges of what we believe are expenditures, as at least it relates to staffing and some of those pieces, and start to have that conversation. And then we will move into still having conversations about values, because there's still some levers that can be pulled and moved there, because we're not done. The next budget work session will be the other essentially 20% of our budget that we've kind of talked about, and we'll do some of deeper dive into that, which are our materials, supplies, operations, our MSOC budgets. And those happen at school and at central admin. And so we'll talk some about those. That is the flexibility portion of our budget to a certain extent. And things live in MSOCs beyond, because we say materials, supplies, operations. You think about things, especially for central office, you may say, oh, well, okay, how many paper clips do you need? Or how many tape dispensers, or those kinds of things. We'll get into what really lives in an MSOC budget and how, yes, some of those dollar amounts live there as well, but there are other supplies that are program related. So for example, instructional material costs for the district live in teaching and learning's MSOC budget. And so we'll go through that and talk about that and talk about MSOC. That's where some of those programmatic expansions and those values start to be expressed, and we'll talk about that as well. And then we would like to start to think about when we engage public comment on what some drafts start to look like on our budget, of what pieces we've started to put together. That June 10th is just the recognition that that is a board meeting, because we are engaged in the process of starting to have real conversations about budget and work session. It is likely that public comment would start to happen in real time about budget. Same thing again on the 24th. We would like to propose to have a work session about budget where we start to bring forth a more kind of packaged look at like all of these pieces of what these things look like. Because we're pretty steadily approaching, and that is our last regular board meeting opportunity before July 10th, and we don't want to submit to ESD without the board having taken a look at that, expressing values, interest, and making sure they're brought along. Again, not that change is happening, and not that change can't happen, but not that we're not adopting anything in July, but we don't want a situation where we've put something out to the ESD believing that this is where we're headed as a district, and then there's drastic sweeping changes between July and August when there's an adoption. So we'd like to believe that we're working towards that together. And then there's the dates of July and then August. And so that's kind of just a tentative proposal of kind of how we're seeing this in the conversations we'd like to have. I won't say, I won't speak for any other staff and say that we'd love to have as many conversations as you want, and if you want to talk every week about it, we will. But we're open to having as many of these as we need to get the process done and kind of work through this together. So that's why they're proposed there. Those are the big dates, and I'd say that aside from the 10th and the 26th, other than those being required by law, there's some flexibility in when the others happen. Although I would say, by nature of the processes that we need to do in the district and some of our contract language, if we don't have conversations about staffing and hear board interest early, contractually we may start to obligate things in our funding because of contract, not necessarily because of interest, and we don't want to have those things be too far separated. So that's the whys. If there's questions or feedback, I'd love to hear. Be very helpful.
I'd like to see that timeline. It's a good timeline. I'm wondering, though, if we're trying to really open up to our community, because we've had these community conversations and stuff, is there a place somewhere in there that, I mean, other than at a board meeting, a budget meeting, and public comment, that each school or group of schools or a town hall meeting could come together where people in that school or that area could talk about what they wanted to continue, what they didn't want to continue, what they'd like to add to it. How does that work into it? Is there any room for that?
So I think there's room. I think we have to talk about what that looks like and how that looks, because when we talk about we can do lots of things, but we can't do everything. And at the level and flexibility of what that looks like. And I think Ben talked about that a little bit and kind of talked about the tension between kind of philosophies and priorities versus kind of the technical operation of that. And the difficulty and the challenge for us all as we do this work will be, we are serving approximately 25,500 funded students, but we really serve more like 27,000 headcount students because of mobility. And when you take into consideration their unique needs across 43 locations, we do not have the level of funding or flexibility to provide everything that all of those interests would address. And so just finding the right way to kind of balance that. And so I think we do, and that's part of what this activity and what we're going to do together next. And then that will allow us some space to think about how we bring along community and provide some opportunity for some of that, and hear that, and then working together to see how that is expressed in the budget. Because I will say that whenever I facilitated or work with a group in Canton, President Hamada, you may have heard me say this before, is that my definition of compromise is equal dissatisfaction for all parties. Because typically when you compromise, not everyone gets everything that they want. Everybody gets a little bit of something that they're committed to, and they tend to make their peace with that. And I think that that's probably the story of any budget development process, because our money is not infinite. But I do think we can. So I'm not saying no, I just think we have to think about how that looks and what that looks like. And that's one of the reasons why we didn't bring public comment in too early. Not because we weren't interested in hearing it, but because there wasn't a plan or a costing out of any of those pieces soon. And so there wasn't too much for them to comment on, but we can talk about where we want to bring that in and what's the right time period or place too.
I mean, I tend to agree with Hamada. Just the way you explained it, I think would be easy for people to understand. It's like, as long as you set expectation, it's like that social contract where, you ask someone for input, but as long as you make it clear that, it's very limited budget, but there are different areas, different schools that have different needs where perhaps that school might say, we just want a behavioral interventionist at our school because we don't have one. Or it might be a school that says, we want choir back, but, we were elected by our constituents, and it would be nice to hear from them at the early stages of this process, because, and again, setting those parameters and those expectations, saying, we're not sure we can make any of this happen, but even when, Mr. Rarick talked about long-term planning, in 4 years, it might be something that this school really wants, but it can't happen this year, but we heard you, and maybe in the long-term goals.
And that's something that I think is another component of our sustainability and solvency process. And I think you would agree with this, Ben, too, is that kind of connecting our ideas year over year. That was another thing that would never show up on a ledger about how we've made this shift as a district. We started thinking about the impact of the decisions we're making, not just in the immediate year, but over multiple years. And so now as we think about budgeting, and now that we're stable, what does the impact of expansion look like over multiple years? And so that's a new conversation and space for us to have as a district, and that's a good space. It's a much better space than the other conversation. So I think we can do that, and so I'm open to that. We can talk about what that could look or feel like. We'll go into a slide of what our voters have expressed interest in, and yes, granted, that was around levy. But they did have some budget implications as well, what their priorities were. But that's not necessarily parents, because what we do know about a lot of our voting public is that they're not always parents. And so how do we create a space for parent voice that might be different from voter voice, and then ensuring what that looks like in terms of representative voice across our district. But yes, we can work on that and get that in there.
And to that, it's a separate matter, but the staffing allocation presentation, we talked about this last year, along with the community input, I guess everybody's community. You know, I think it's really important that we hear from our principals, and we've talked about that, and I know Mariah had mentioned for the staffing allocation that there are opportunities for them to come to the table and discuss their priorities. And I don't know, I'm hearing that didn't really happen with all of our principals, and I don't know if it's that they didn't know about this session or if they
So-
chose not to come.
Sure, I can speak a little bit about that too, and some things we put into place this year. So we did hold 2 staffing roundtable meetings right after we distributed the allocations. Very high participation from some of our principals. There may have been some that didn't attend. This year, Jamie Frazier, Director of HR Operations, who manages our basic education allocations, she and I and Tiffany Phelps went to levels meetings at the elementary, middle, and high school. We've been twice to middle school, twice to high school, and once to elementary, and we've got a schedule to visit back. And we talked about the how might be conversation. And we said, so how might we look at staffing differently? Because what we've done for classrooms is we use that CBA language. And certainly that is a parameter that we need to meet. But we've said, instead of having just enrollment projections divided by a ratio at the secondary level, and then at the elementary, the ratio for K through 3 and then 4 through 6, how might we consider the unique and specific needs of your school in a staffing allocation model? So what if we staffed baseline, but then we began to think about a weighted formula or different things? What would that look like? And they've given us some really great feedback, and we've taken detailed notes. And Dr. Behringer said to me the other day, thank you, they feel heard, they feel respected. And I said, those ideas will be very important in our conversations with the board, and I'll be able to share, here are some of the things that they've said. And so they've already begun to give me a couple of ideas about some areas where they feel like across the board we could look at some enhancements, some ways to look at the staffing model that would meet the social emotional needs of our students, a variety of things. Music was brought up. So they've had lots of those conversations. So I feel really good about taking strategic steps, and we started the conversation in September with a class size meeting. It was a cross-community meeting. And then, gosh, I think it was in November or December that we met with the first levels meeting. And so we've had those conversations for the last 3 months.
You're making certain that every building is being heard.
Yes, they're all required to be at levels. This is a little different. This isn't an optional meeting, so it's a required meeting that they have with their supervisor, and I've had the opportunity to go into that meeting. And so I know that I'm reaching all of them because they're supposed to be there, and they are sharing.
So in other words, you have some sort of a system whereby you understand that the leadership of that building is saying these are our priorities every single day.
On
No,
the staffing
so-
aspect, that's my
So,
work.
right, so let's be clear in this in a different way, that we actually had a conversation about this in the administrative cabinet. And this came up because that's where the principal supervisors are there, the EDLEs are there. And talking about this exact conversation with the principals and their level of engagement in this, and wanting to be just more invested and engaged in the process of budgeting all the way through. And we actually shared this presentation with that group too, so that they could see and went through the same activities, and talked about how the principals might be involved. And I talked about hopes of that and fears of that, and I still have concerns. So one of the other things I often tell people, and I usually talk about this when developing surveys, but you always say you never open a door you can't close. So setting those expectations early of when we're asking for your input in the process and your desires, does not mean that we are genies and grant your wishes. Because when we ask 42 building leaders about the unique needs of their buildings and their top 3 priorities, even their top 1 priority, some of those may overlap, but we're likely to probably get at least 22 different ones. And so how do we start to fund and put that together? And so we talked to the EDLEs about that. And they agreed that as they've had these conversations, that they could get principals to consensus on a collective by level of these are the considerations and needs at elementary school. These are the considerations and needs at middle school. These are the considerations and needs at high school in that way. Still recognizing that there's a space for flexibility. And I will say that as we continue to go through this budget process, and every year we get an opportunity to make it better, I think our pathway to an optimal design and model will be about our innovation and flexibility of how we solve this problem. Because we will not have enough funding to provide every building with, I want to be careful not calling out exact positions in that way, but like in a perfect world, we would say, I think we could agree that every school would need a nurse, a social worker, a this, and each of us could come up with what we would want in every building in our school district. We don't have the funding for that. The state doesn't provide it. We don't levy our taxpayers. There are rules around that. And every school may not need exactly those things, even though we feel that they're important. And so I think there's a space for flexibility in design. And then a space for us also saying that there's a commitment and a value in the school district that these things matter. So everyone has these, and then there's flexibility on picking the other pieces that belong there. So I think flexibility and how dollars are leveraged might be a solution too. That may give some space of deciding how some things happen in a school and give principals more ownership and decision-making power over which positions and which roles.
And I'm absolutely, from the beginning in those levels meetings, we've said this is an opportunity to talk about how might we. There are no promises. We cannot promise that we can do all these things, but we want to hear from you. And I think that's a big shift from last year to this year. So last year we met with them after the allocations went out. And I think that what I heard from them is, this is good, but you're showing us how to make do with what we have. Can we help in designing what it looks like? And so that's what we did differently this year. And so I do believe we've met that need, and we have already heard some really important patterns and trends that are going to be very useful as we build this.
So as we're having conversations about interest priorities of different groups, this is the not audience in that sense, board participation, audience opportunity. So you're going to get a card. It's just a note card. And I would like for you to just list things that for you as a board director are important budget priorities. Right? There's no limit in this. It's your card.
So it's hard to know because it's like there's certain questions like Core 24, I don't know how that impacts what any changes would be, then how to support schools with that, or.
This is, so what I haven't asked of yet, this is a personal reflection list of things that are, so you don't have to share this. This is not in that space. This is just kind of making some notes. If you'd rather hold them in your head, that's okay. Mm-hmm. But like just start thinking about some things that are of value to you and that have budget implication. They can be things that you've heard from the community. They can be things that over time have been something that has been a concern or an interest for you as you've watched Kent School grow and change. So I don't want our next activities to seem too cruel. So I don't want you to continue to write and write and write, although I do want you to be in a good place when you stop. So if you don't feel like you're in a good place, don't stop writing yet. I'd ask you to do me one favor in terms of disclosing what's on your list. Will you just count the number of items that are there? No, so all of that is only 3 things?
Well, yeah, but it's specific to the 3. Like, it's under the 3 buckets.
You can't chunk them yet. Each one counts as an individual thing.
Okay.
Each one counts. At this point, we're at the level of everything is on the table. And so if everything is on the table, each one is its own individual thing, even though they might be related. So we will create families for these things in a few minutes. But how many items are there? Because I'm just trying to get to a place of where are we starting in terms of the enormity of what are things that are up for consideration? And I'm curious.
I just have 3.
Okay.
And
Okay. So 23. I won't make any assumptions about how they overlap, but I would probably guess that some of them are similar or at least related topics. Although it's possible for there to be 23 different things. Some of those are probably overlapping or repetitive kind of ideas of things. So, and we did a similar activity in executive cabinet. So we pushed ourselves as well, and we came up with a list of all representing the communities that we serve. And it was more than what we'd have budget capacity for. And I would probably guess that the things that are listed there are bigger than our budget. And they probably are 23 things that are somewhat individual interests. So if you have more than 3 things on your list, and this would apply to the details of those, so I need you to take at least 3 away. I know, don't give me the look. I need you to take 3 away.
We don't know what they are.
I'm not asking you what they are. You have to tell me. This is your process of how you need to take 3 away. One way that you may want to consider that and think about it is a by budget account code, kind of this piece. So if something on your list is at the cost center or location level of detail, then it's probably too small to be a board priority and a board interest. And I'm not saying that it's not important when I say too small, but it is at a level of operational detail that won't create flexibility on the budget to be able to create space to actually make it happen. So for example, let me see if I can give you an example of what something like that might be. We don't want to see expenditures on supplies at central admin any larger than, I don't know, $1,000 for the year. I'm not saying that's a real thing on anybody's list. It's probably, but like if something were at that level, I would say that like, I would suggest that, okay, so maybe an interest might be you want to see reduced spending about supplies might be a thing. But like a level of specificity at that level is probably something you can cross off your list because we're going to need some flexibility in figuring out how to make the real interest happen. So that might be a strategy. Or you can find 3 things that you're not holding on to so tightly. I know, it's hard.
Can we merge 2 together?
Okay, I will let you solve that way. If you want even a new card to kind of reshuffle them together in a new way, that's fine. Look, you can have as many of these as you like. They're for your work. But yes, so you gotta narrow down. And it's hard because it's taken you probably down to half. each get the blind card. Yes, I am, but I don't want to, I want this to be like, because I want this to be about what you all are, and it's a little odd, because like the PowerPoint's been out there, so it's not like you couldn't have looked already, but, and I thought about that, I was like, I don't want to put that out there, but I was like, it's whatever. Because I have a feeling that we're more similar than we are different across all of this, but it's a good process. So, Director Bowen, before you get too deeply creative, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to push you even further, and will you do me a favor, because it may reconsider how you do this. On your line card, I need you to pick one. So of all the things that were there, I need you to list the one thing. If we can only do one thing. Everybody, this is one where if you have more than one thing on your card, you have to put one on the note card. I know. We struggle. That's okay. It's different. I can look, so there's And so now this becomes participatory in terms of you all choose how we go next about this next piece. And it depends on where you all would like to be as a district, as a board. We need to talk about what the ones are. And how we talk about what the ones are, up to you all. Would you prefer that I take the cards back and we just talk about them kind of agnostically without ownership of who that one belongs to? Or would you all prefer to have a conversation about your ones and you all share them? That doesn't mean that you can't advocate for any of them or have conversations. I want us to have conversation about them, but it's up to you all how you prefer to talk about your ones.
I'll talk about them.
And so that's fine. You all want to talk about your one, and that's perfect.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to ask, what's your one?
Safety, just making sure our kids are safe at school.
Okay. So, I love it. Spoiler alert, I probably would have said that no matter what you would have said. But I love it because I love that those are big bucket things. And there's lots of different ways that we can address that. There's lots of ways that that can be approached as a board. And they're not all that different. I kept it in first. We haven't gotten down to the board's 3. But this is what the KSD voting public, their interests were and their priorities as it related to levy. These were their top 3. Safety and security in school buildings. Now, theirs is at a more granular level than what I said as a board and as a district operator, like we need to keep it to. Discipline and bullying prevention programs. Science, technology, engineering, and math. I apologize for that transformation. It actually should be STEAM, is what it is. It is not STEM. That is a typo in that respect. It is actually STEAM, and I apologize for that. And it came directly from, there's the link to the presentation in October, but that's where that came from. And so those are the voting public. Now, voting public is not parents, but that is one set of our community. Not just parents, I apologize. Yeah, they are primarily not all parents.
It was like a 60, 40.
Yeah. Executive cabinet interest. So when we did the activity, we started out like you all, and as Mariah said, we had to share we shared ours out loud, and we kind of worked through and processed, and we came up with 3. and they're broad as well. I would say it may not seem like it at this level. Some of the things that in a more granular level showed up here are expressed in big buckets. We got as creative as you did very immediately, Director Poet and Director Manager, about like how can we start to chunk these so that the things that we are interested in and we know we need as a district show up in big buckets, because we need some flexibility in how that happens. And so that's where we've landed. To be fair, I don't think there's not a whole lot of detail underlying what those three things are, because it could look lots of different ways, depending on how we move with the budget. But the reason why we chose these three, and I don't want to just speak for the rest of the chime in here if you'd like, was because the comprehensive instructional program represented lots of things that we've heard public say, lots of things that we would like to do and see in terms of course offerings, and lots of different things for our students expressed, and that's where that lives.
Yeah, and I would say it was interesting to hear your words because particularly mental health, and I think that was yours, Director Boardroom, and certainly what we were thinking about with diverse and premier workforce as well is how do we invest in wellness supports for all of our staff to be able to continue to do this wonderful work with our students. So I think it was a similar kind of theme. We did a broader heading, but we were thinking about supports, whether it's additional staffing or whether or not that's actual wellness supports that can be provided.
Right, and so student supports, not a surprise, live under one. So whether those are about courses or about social emotional supports or others, safety, discipline, those are those kind of things that live there. Professional development and how we provide supports for our staff. As we talk about equity, as we talk about other pieces of that live in that professional development piece, and diverse and premier workforce is what are those pieces and resources for staff retention, recruitment, and all of those pieces there. So those are ours. We've heard yours as an individual, and so we need to have continued conversation about a collective board, because what I would like to see, so there's a reason why it's three. It's not because everybody else picked three and I picked three. It's because how we move forward as a district and how you all move forward as a board is a collective interest. And so your individual constituent communities are slightly different. But it would be too easy to retain individual interests instead of a collective. If I said, okay, there's 5 board members and we can accept 5 priorities or 5 interests. And so we've got to get to a place where there's at least less than 5. And then I thought about 4 and I said, well, that's not fair either, because one person could concede theirs to the good of the group. But 3 really makes a concerted effort of a group of 5 individuals who have the responsibility of setting a course for several adults and lots of little people. And so that's the goal of kind of getting to this interest idea, and why I made you list all those things and not share them and then start crossing things off and then pick one. Because what I heard are 4 things that do chunk into larger buckets, but we really do need to hear some detail of like what are those pieces, and are those really the collective priorities of our board. And so for you all to have some discussion space around what that looks like. I won't say that you have to have an absolute definitive answer tonight, but we will have to be close to that by March, because otherwise we will not be able to start developing and costing out possibilities for you in a way that provides real time, space, and change. And so you've still got 12 minutes.
And just, you know, I think, and I didn't even think about it when Director Van Gossen said it's about the principals. You know, we're elected to represent our constituents, and so again, this is important work, and it's important to know what's important to them, and then, you know, the principals know their communities very well, and just having that insight onto what's important to them is going to be important to me in finalizing, because I'm not queen of the world, and so I really would like to know what the people I represent, which is everyone in this district. We all technically represent everyone in this district. I really would like to have a handle on what's important to them, because I think that's the piece sometimes that is missing. And, you know, I went to WASDA conference and they said the strongest districts get input from the community on major decisions. So, you know, as we move forward to try and make some of these big, important decisions, it is helpful, I think, to know what the, you know, what our constituents think, what the key stakeholders think. The principals and teachers, school staff, they know what's going on, and, you know, that combination of voice, I think, is helpful, and would be helpful to me.
So I will, yes, and think that's definitely a possibility. I mean, I think that's something that can happen. We talked about ways that the principals can do that, or principal voice can be expressed in this. I think there's an opportunity to hear from more community in our budget process. I will say, I think we have to be careful about the opportunity to expert in this. I'll leave that to our executive director of legal and labor about the fine line between interests that are expressed of certain labor groups that need to have at the bargaining table versus just general kind of interests of the district. Because even our principals are a bargaining group. And so as long as the interests, I would say, are outside of working conditions and compensation and those kinds of things, then it's an absolute safe space to have those conversations. But I don't want us to start having budget allocation conversations that have to be bargained. But I do think there's a space for that. So I just put that out there, and he didn't jump up and stop me, so I think I'm okay. But yeah, so I did make a note.
I was listening.
Okay, so I did make a note of that about just how we can get more parental and community involvement and input in that. And I think I've heard opportunity to connect other possible community engagement conversations and maybe include some space for budget in that as well. And that might be a great opportunity for us to hear from communities that we don't usually hear from about the budget development process, so or in the budget development process. So that's great. I also did hear that we're on the path to our board coming up with the beginnings of a collective group of interests, because I heard at least some big bucket ideas that are probably really only 2 different things out of the 4 things that you all listed, probably only fall into 2 realms, not 4. And so that's good. And then we can come back and talk about how that whittles down again. And so now we have some information about how to guide our March kind of time together and what that looks like. Are there other questions or suggestions or things that you'd like to see or that you didn't hear enough about that you want to know more about, so we can make sure we're providing what you need as we start to engage more deeply in budget?
Yeah, I mean, for me, sorry, it's just those cost benefit analysis, like on things like what Core 24 even is looking like and going to cost and how much. And again, the Learning First, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about the double and triple classrooms and things like that. So just having a cost benefit analysis on that, like, and I think just for me overarching, because this is the way, if you're talking about my home finances, the way I run everything is just where can I save money and to put money towards other things that are more fun sometimes or more impactful. You know, if I can save money by, you know, cutting my cable so that I can, you know, put a new roof on the house or something like that. It's like where we're spending money and returns on investment and all that kind of stuff helps me also understand better what we're doing and making sure that the money is going in the right direction, or in the direction that we all agree is worthwhile.
And to me, tonight was very helpful. I finally got what you were saying. Thank you very much. I just want to say that. There was a piece missing there that I didn't connect with, which came through. How do we go forward, or help me to understand if we're coming back on the 4th of March or whatever, Is that with our knowledge of our community? Is that with us talking to our community at large? Is that with just us coming with our opinions? Or, and the community's interest perhaps will be done later?
So as I think you expressed, I'd say more than once, President Hamada, about how quick the pace is of things happening in this school district. And as much as I think I could say we all would like for things to just slow down a little bit sometimes, there's only 180 days, and those 180 days happen, no matter how much we want to put the brakes in certain areas. So I know that there's been some, I guess, request or interest in our public in engaging in some conversations around a different topic. But I would say that there's an opportunity, even in the midst of those conversations, to have a larger conversation about the operations of the school district, because I think the interest of the public around certain recent events also has budget implications. So that might be a great opportunity to engage groups. So I think that we have some opportunities, if not fully planned, but some ideas of some things that may happen in between where we can capitalize on that. I know that we may have some opportunity. If not, we can consider what that looks like. I want to be careful. I got some good clarification about calling something a budget hearing and some rules under the law of how that needs to happen. So if we're going to engage in formal public comment about budget priorities, for example, maybe during a work session or during a regular meeting or something, we want to make sure that have our public be aware that it is, they can comment about it and it can be about budget and expenditures, but we're not going to call it a hearing because there's some other complications around that formal titling. So we can figure out what that looks like. I will say that, I won't say that it is not the expectation that that will happen later after the 5th. I can't guarantee that all of that will happen between now and the 5th. I think that you all continue to have conversations as board members as you do your work, that you're engaging with the community. So you will, of course, come back with new information, because as you engage with more people just in the natural work that you do, you will hear more. But we can think about ways that we can get that messaging out and work with that, and we can circle back around. And there's a process I heard Saturday about the process for scheduling and how all of that happens, to let people know, and you all decide how to use it as well. So we can work on that. But it can't wait until, like, there's only so far we can push that again before it becomes meaningful, useful, and real. And so it will need to happen in a relatively short period of time.
Can we utilize thought exchange?
I believe so. We can leverage, it doesn't always have to be in person. I know that some of our communities in person works best, but I think so, we can use that. I know that we can also leverage other districts, what they've done, other districts have done things as far as even putting out survey. And we can use thought exchange and some other pieces as well. So we can consider lots of ways to reach different communities. And yes, and I did hear about a plan for incorporating that, so that's not a hard one to do.
So, I'm kind of specific, detail person, so I can go out, I guess, on my own and start talking to the community about this if there's nothing planned.
So there isn't anything preventing you from talking about budget or budget interest of the community in that way. Again, I would just always caution about conversations with labor group individuals. And so, yes, and I mean, so, and we all wear multiple hats and play multiple roles. And so there are staff who are teachers and also parents and blah, 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 and on and on. So it doesn't mean that there is someone who is not a labor group represented person who doesn't have an interest or a concern that is related to something that's happening, that's related to their child or some other piece. So it's not that everything is off the table and you can't talk to any labor group.
Right, and I think if we go back to Buzz's presentation that he did with you, you are their elected representatives as well. They can share interests with you. Where the problem is if you were to bargain back with them and said, well, would you rather have this or would you rather have that? That's where we encounter direct dealing. So you certainly can listen to their interests, and that can very much inform your thinking. That helps.
Yeah, it's just like, setting clear expectations that there's no assurances that anything could be, would get in the budget, which is just making sure people want to understand why they're giving input and what you know, if it's just an interest, to gather interest, then it's fine, but if they think you're gonna make a promise to fulfill an idea, then that kind of breaks the social contract and can cause, you know, just trust issues.
Certainly, if there are pieces that are already in the contract, that would have to go through that process. That's even beyond the budget process. So for instance, the learning first schedule is in the contract. So that will have to be addressed through bargaining. It's not to say that there are not some things that can be done budget-wise to address some things that are already in the contract.
Can I add to that particular issue, class size? So I guess I wouldn't want to talk specifics about that, but there have been instances where I would have to wonder, you know, do we do proper analysis based on building needs, and are we doing analysis to see, like a science program, where you don't need to have, you know, maybe we have 13 people. Are we doing that kind of efficiency type analysis? Now we're looking at class sizes. You know, in the past, we haven't done that. But that seems to be
I think the partnership with our principals is key. So when they have received their allocation, they receive a full bucket, if you will, of FTE, 59.6, and then they use that FTE to staff their master schedules. And so I think that closer communication with principals to say, so are we running classes with 13 and 14, or do you have a science class sitting with 34 students? I think it's really important for us to be partners with our school-based leaders in that work.
And last but not least, only because just to circle back around, you did mention about policy 6001 and 6002. I will not say that we're going to turn the March meeting into a policy work session, because we won't, but if you want to have some space and time to discuss those two policies or some nuances of that, you made mention of that or reference, then we could create some space for that as well.
Sounds good.
So, we are just over a minute, so I'm going to stop talking. And
Does anybody else have any pressing thing they want to discuss? We are adjourned.
thank you. Thank you. And you can, I don't want any of that. I mean, I'll take it if you want to share it. I don't ever mind. I mean, like, it is helpful for us to think about it. But I was like, if you don't want to, you don't have to. And like I said, I will not turn down information that will help us think about, like, what direction we should be headed in as a district. So, like, that is useful information. Thank you.